field notebook, taken off a dead German lieutenant near the Mussolini Canal in February 1944, made its way back through the lines of the Hermann Göring division with a single page marked for translation. The lieutenant had been with the division for 8 months, through Sicily and the retreat up the Italian boot, and whatever he had seen in the 3 nights before he died had unsettled him enough to write it down while he still could. The black devils are all around us. Every time we come into the line, the entry read, "They come like cats in the dark. We never hear them go. We find our sentries with their throats cut and their weapons still slung. Yesterday, they left a card on one of ours. It said the worst is still to come." He had underlined that last line twice. The notebook passed from a company post to a battalion intelligence officer, then further up, the way documents like this did when a unit's morale was becoming a command problem rather than a private one. Somewhere along that chain, an officer asked the obvious question: which Allied unit was operating in that sector? The answer that came back did not match anything in the German order of battle for Italian units, American units, or British units. It was neither infantry nor rangers nor commandos in the way the Wehrmacht understood the term. It was something that did not, on paper, look dangerous at all. A single understrength brigade, half its men American, half of them Canadian, that Berlin's own intelligence summaries had trouble classifying. The Germans held opposite them settled, without much interest in accuracy, on a name that would end up in more diaries than that one: Schwarze Teufel, the Black Devils. That is not the story most people know about the Second World War's elite units. The popular memory of American special operations in that war belongs almost entirely to 2 images: the Rangers scaling the cliffs at Point du Hoc on D-Day, the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne dropping into Normandy under a rising moon. Both stories are true, both are extraordinary, and both happened in France, in the summer everyone remembers, in the campaign that ended up on movie screens. This is not that story. This is the story of what came before it. A joint American-Canadian force built from a canceled British plan to sabotage Norwegian hydroelectric plants, trained in the freezing mountains of Montana by men who had never worked together before and were not supposed to exist as a combined national unit at all. A force that fought not in France, but in the mud and rock of Italy, in a campaign so overshadowed by what followed it that most of the men who fought it went home to a country that barely knew their unit's name. What they left behind them was not a place in the popular memory. It was something more specific, and in a way, more durable. A reputation written not by American war correspondents or by the unit's own after-action reports, but by the enemy soldiers who faced them in the dark, men with every professional incentive to minimize what an opposing force could do, who instead reached for the word devil because their own military vocabulary had nothing else that fit. To understand why, you have to go back 2 years before that notebook was found, to a plan the British themselves had already decided would not work, and to the one American officer who was ordered to build something out of it anyway. To understand what the Germans were actually describing when they wrote that word down, you have to understand what this force was built from and how deliberately strange that origin was. It began in London in the spring of 1942 with a British inventor named Geoffrey Pike, a man with no military rank and a reputation for eccentric brilliance, who proposed a raiding force trained to move on skis and snow vehicles deep into occupied Norway and destroy the hydroelectric plants that powered German industry there. The plan was called Project Plough. The British, stretched thin and unconvinced, handed it to the Americans at a conference at Chequers in March of 1942. General George Marshall accepted it before anyone had fully worked out whether it was realistic. The officer eventually assigned to evaluate it, a lieutenant colonel on the Army's Operations Division staff named Robert T. Frederick, read the plan and concluded it was close to a military fiasco. The vehicles didn't exist yet. The targets were more heavily defended than Pike's proposal accounted for. Frederick recommended the plan be scrapped. Instead, in June of 1942, Eisenhower handed it back to him with new instructions. Since he understood better than anyone why it wouldn't work as written, he could build the force that would make it work. Frederick was given a name for the unit deliberately chosen to mean nothing to German intelligence: the 1st Special Service Force, a title bland enough that a spy skimming a personnel roster might mistake it for an entertainment unit sent to boost troop morale. He was given 6 weeks to build it from nothing. He built it in Montana, at Fort William Henry Harrison outside Helena, drawing half his manpower from American volunteers and half from Canadian soldiers, whose own government had to quietly authorize an unprecedented arrangement. Canadian troops folded directly into an American combat unit, wearing a shared insignia with USA and Canada stitched into the same red spearhead. Roughly 900 men from each country. The preferred recruit was not a career soldier. Frederick's people looked for lumberjacks, forest rangers, hunters, game wardens, prospectors, men who already knew how to survive outdoors before the army ever touched them. The training that followed was designed less to teach skills than to manufacture a specific kind of soldier. Men who arrived at Fort Harrison were parachuting within 48 hours of getting off the train, with no jump towers, no preliminary ground school, nothing but a British-style static line and an instructor telling them to keep their knees bent. They skied under Norwegian instructors. They climbed rock faces in winter. They trained in hand-to-hand combat under a former Shanghai municipal police instructor named Dermot O'Neill, drilled with German weapons until they could strip and fire them faster than their own, and marched 60 miles carrying full packs in a single stretch that some companies covered in under 20 hours. The washout rate was steep enough that the men who remained were, by definition, the ones who had wanted to be there more than they had wanted to be comfortable. Private Daniel Kowalski, a 20-year-old from a mill town outside Pittsburgh who had never seen mountains before his train pulled into Helena, wrote his sister that winter that the training was nothing like they told us it would be, and I mean that as a compliment. What he didn't write, because there was no way to make it sound like anything other than what it was that during a live fire demolitions exercise in December of 1942, a charge went off 9 seconds early. He lost hearing in one ear for 3 weeks and never reported it, because the men who reported things like that got pulled from training, and he had come too far to be pulled. By the time this force sailed for the Mediterranean in the autumn of 1943, it did not look, on paper, like a force capable of frightening a professional German army. Roughly 1,800 men, no armor, no heavy artillery of its own. What it had instead was a doctrine Frederick had built into every man in it, that isolation was not a crisis to wait out, but a condition to fight in, and a mountain in Italy that the German army considered impossible to climb from the side they weren't watching. The mountain was called La Difensa, and the Germans holding it had not bothered to fortify its northeast face, because no one climbs a sheer rock wall in the dark to attack a position from the one direction it cannot be reached from. The German defenders, roughly 300 men of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, dug into stone emplacements with interlocking machine gun fire covering every approach a sane commander would use, had watched 2 previous Allied attempts fail against the mountain's southern and eastern slopes with heavy losses. Fifth Army planners estimated that a successful assault, if one came at all, would take 2 to 3 days of grinding attrition. On the night of December 2nd, 1943, after a barrage of more than 70,000 artillery rounds had spent the day working over the ridge, the men of the force's 2nd Regiment began climbing the northeast face in silence, roped together in the dark, using bayonets and fingers to find holds on rock that rose nearly 200 feet at close to a 70-degree pitch. No one spoke above a whisper. Any man who slipped climbed back onto the rope without a word, because a shout would have ended the operation before it began. They came over the top a little after dawn into positions that had never been built to face that direction, and the fight that followed lasted a fraction of what 5th Army headquarters had planned for. By mid-morning on December 3rd, the mountain that was supposed to take days had changed hands in hours. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McWilliam, the Canadian officer who had led the 1st Battalion up that climb, did not live to see the position fully secured. He was killed by mortar fire moving toward the next objective, La Remetanea, within the same 24 hours. One of 27 Canadians who died taking a mountain, most of their own high command, had quietly written off as too costly to attempt directly. What the force's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Finn Roll, pulled out of the prisoners taken on that summit told its own story. 43 Germans came off La Difensa into Allied hands that morning, and in the interrogations that followed, a pattern emerged that Roll noted was something close to professional surprise. These were not green troops. They were veterans of the Panzer Grenadier line, men who had held positions against artillery and infantry assaults before, and knew how those fights were supposed to unfold. What none of them had an answer for was how anyone had come up the wall behind them without being heard. The cost to the men who climbed it was not small. 73 dead, more than 300 wounded, another 100 pulled off the mountain in the days after, with frostbite and exhaustion so severe they couldn't stand. But the position that was supposed to hold for days had fallen in one night, and word of how it had fallen moved through the German line faster than any single report could carry it. Not through cowardice. Through the much more unsettling realization that the geography they had trusted to defend them had simply stopped applying. La Difensa was not the end of the mountain chain. It was the first rung of one. In the 6 weeks that followed, the force fought its way across a series of peaks that don't appear in most popular histories of the Italian campaign, because none of them had names anyone outside the units fighting there would remember. La Remetanea, taken within days of Difensa, while the wounded from the first climb were still being carried down on stretcher relays that took 8 hours each way. Monte Sammucro, assaulted on Christmas Day, 1943, while men who had been raised to think of that date as a day of rest instead spent it clearing a ridge under fire. Radicosa in early January. Monte Majo on January 6th, taken in a night assault that earned Frederick himself a second Distinguished Service Cross, and within 2 weeks a promotion to Brigadier General, at the time one of the youngest general officers in the U.S. Army. The cost of those 6 weeks did not show up in any single dramatic battle. It showed up in the muster rolls. The force had sailed from North America roughly 1,800 strong. By the time the mountain chain was cleared in mid-January, its combat strength had fallen below 500 men fit to fight. Entire companies were commanded by sergeants because every officer above them was dead, wounded, or evacuated with frostbite, so severe the medics couldn't save the toes. What the German defenders facing that chain of mountains began reporting up their own chain of command was not fear of a large force. It was something closer to confusion about how a force that small kept doing what it was doing. A captured German operations summary from the 305th Infantry Division, translated by Allied intelligence in early January, noted that the unit opposing them along the ridge appeared repeatedly at points the division's own maps classified as impassable to infantry movement at night, and recommended, in the flat, procedural language military reports used to disguise alarm as administration, that security depth on adjoining sectors be increased to a minimum of 300 meters. 300 meters was not a request born of respect. It was a request born of an army that had run out of other explanations. By the time the surviving 500 men came off that ridgeline in mid-January 1944, the force had spent 6 weeks proving that the wall at La Difensa had not been an anomaly. It had been the first demonstration of a method. Go where the map says you can't. Arrive where the enemy has stopped watching, and treat every mountain the way you'd treat the one nobody thought to fortify. They were about to take that method somewhere far more dangerous than a mountain. A flat, exposed, 20-mile beachhead where there was no cliff to climb and no ridge to hide behind, only the open dark of no man's land, and the choice of whether to sit in it or own it. They arrived at Anzio on February 1st, 1944, to relieve 2 Ranger battalions that had been effectively destroyed at Cisterna days earlier, and they were handed a sector no unit their size should have been asked to hold. Roughly 13 kilometers of front, a quarter of the entire Anzio perimeter, against a full German division with barely 1,200 men fit to carry a weapon. There was no relief coming. They would hold that stretch of line for 99 straight days. What they did with those 99 days was not sit in their foxholes and wait for the Germans to attack. Every night, patrols went out with their faces blacked with boot polish, moving through drainage ditches and reed beds along the Mussolini Canal, crossing into ground the Germans considered their own rear area. They cut throats where a shot would have brought return fire. They dragged prisoners back across the line before their own posts even realized a man was missing. And they left something behind on the German dead and on captured positions that the German soldiers holding that stretch of canal came to recognize on sight. A small card, stamped with the unit's spearhead insignia, printed with a line in German, intended for whoever found the body next. Das dicke Ende kommt noch. The worst is still to come. The tactical effect showed up in German positions that quietly pulled back from the canal's edge, in outposts abandoned before dawn, in a defensive line that crept backward by hundreds of meters over weeks without a single conventional assault ever being launched against it. Soldiers who had survived Stalingrad and North Africa were losing sleep to a threat they couldn't locate on a map, coming from a unit whose own size, if the Germans holding that sector had known it, would have made the fear almost embarrassing. It was somewhere in those 99 days that the notebook entry from the opening of this story was written and carried up the German chain of command. A lieutenant, 8 months into the Italian campaign, describing sentries found with their throats cut and their weapons still slung, describing an enemy that came like cats in the dark and left cards behind that promised more of the same. Schwarze Teufel, the Black Devils, not a name given in mockery. In German military slang, it was the same category of word soldiers had once reached for describing the French Foreign Legion, reserved for an enemy that didn't seem to be playing by rules anyone recognized. One of the men earning that reputation, one night in early February, was a 28-year-old Canadian sergeant named Tommy Prince from the Broken Head Ojibwe Nation in Manitoba. On the night of February 8th, Prince crept to an abandoned farmhouse, roughly 200 meters from German positions, laid nearly 1,500 yards of telephone wire back to Allied lines under fire, and spent the next 24 hours reporting German troop movements from inside a building the Germans still considered theirs. At one point, walking out into the open in full view of both sides, pretending to be a farmer, checking on a damaged clothesline to repair the wire a shell had cut. He would leave the war as one of Canada's most decorated Indigenous soldiers, holder of both the military medal and the American Silver Star. The Germans who tracked his unit's activity along that stretch of canal had their own word for what men like him represented. They called them ghosts. By the time the breakout from Anzio finally came in late May, the force had spent 3 months doing something no textbook described, holding a line not by strength of numbers, but by making the darkness itself feel like enemy territory to the men on the other side of it. The breakout from Anzio didn't slow them down. It pointed them at a city. On the night of June 3, 1944, with the German defense of Rome beginning to collapse under the weight of the Allied advance, 5th Army Headquarters gave Frederick's men an objective that mattered more for what it symbolized than for its tactical difficulty. Reach the bridges over the Tiber before retreating German units could destroy them, and get there before anyone else did. Frederick sent his 1st Regiment up the Via Castellina through the night, and ahead of the main column, a hand-picked patrol of 60 men drawn from across the Corps, led by a force captain named Mark Radcliffe, pushed into the city itself in the early hours of June 4th. They came through the Porta San Giovanni on the Via Tuscolana, a little after 6 in the morning, among the first Allied troops to set foot inside Rome. A city that, 4 days later, would vanish from the front pages of every newspaper in the world the moment the headlines shifted to Normandy. Frederick himself was wounded 3 times that day and stayed in command anyway, a habit that had already earned him 2 Distinguished Service Crosses and would, by the war's end, add up to 8 Purple Hearts, more than almost any American general who served in the war. They had taken a mountain no one thought could be climbed. They had held a beachhead line with a force a fraction the size the position required. They had walked into the capital of fascist Italy, ahead of armies many times their strength. And in less than a week, the world's attention would move on to a beach in France and take most of the credit for the war's turning point with it. What stayed behind in the German record rather than the American one was the tally of what it had actually cost the Wehrmacht to fight this particular 1,800 men for a single year. There is a number buried in the official record of this force that says more about what the Germans were actually facing than any single quote from any single diary. Across 251 days of combat, from the mountain chain above Cassino to the beachhead at Anzio to the fighting that followed through southern France, this unit suffered 2,114 casualties. Its authorized strength, on paper, the number the Army had budgeted for and expected to lose and replace across that same stretch of fighting, was roughly 1,800. The casualty figure worked out to 134% of the force that was ever supposed to exist. That number should describe a unit that ceased to function. An army does not typically survive losing more men than it started with and keep attacking on schedule. What the German officers facing this force across those months slowly worked out, in the flat professional language of after-action reports, rather than the language of fear, was that the arithmetic didn't apply here the way it applied everywhere else. Men were wounded, evacuated, and in some cases returned to the line within days rather than weeks. Companies that should have stopped functioning as fighting units kept sending patrols out at night. The force absorbed losses that would have ended most units as a coherent fighting force, and simply kept coming from the same directions it had always come from. A German intelligence assessment compiled in the weeks after the Anzio breakout, reviewing patrol activity along the Mussolini Canal sector, reached a conclusion that the officer writing it did not intend as flattery. The unit opposite this sector, the report noted, operated with an effective strength and an operational tempo inconsistent with its known table of organization, and continued offensive patrolling activity through casualty rates that should have reduced it to a defensive posture months earlier. What that officer had no vocabulary for, because no army had needed the vocabulary before, was a force built from the ground, up in the mountains of Montana, to treat every man as a complete fighting unit on his own. A force where a soldier alone in the dark, with no orders and no officer within reach, did not stop functioning, because the training had never given him permission to consider stopping an option. 1,800 men who had been taught individually in Fort Harrison snow and rock that isolation was not a crisis. It was simply the job. That is what the number in the official record actually measures, not an army that avoided losses, an army that had been built to keep fighting past the point where the math said it should have stopped, and an enemy that spent nearly a year writing reports, trying to explain how that was possible, without ever quite finding the words that weren't, in the end, the same word a dead lieutenant's notebook had already reached for in the mud above the Mussolini Canal. The force was dissolved on December 5, 1944, in a field outside Villeneuve-Loubet in southern France, not because it had failed at anything, but because Ottawa had run out of replacements to send it, and Washington decided a unit that small wasn't worth the administrative weight of keeping half American, half Canadian. On the books, the Canadians paraded past the Americans one last time, a final review in a cold field, and then went back to their own army's units. The Americans folded into other regiments and airborne divisions. 18 months after it was built from lumberjacks and game wardens in a Montana winter, the unit that had done all of this simply stopped existing on paper. No one at that final parade knew about the notebook. It had already made its trip up through German intelligence channels, been logged, translated, filed. One document among thousands moving through a losing army's paperwork in the winter of 1944, of no more apparent significance than any other captured diary pulled off any other dead officer in any other muddy field in Italy. It sat in that file for years. It surfaces now only because historians going back through the record noticed how many separate German accounts, written independently by men with no reason to compare notes, kept reaching for the same word to describe the same unit. Not every one of those accounts can be traced back to a single verified page in a single archive today. Some of what got repeated among the men who fought there and passed down afterward drifted the way war stories do. Details sharpened, sequences compressed, one soldier's account becoming everyone's memory of what happened. What can be verified is what the official record shows without needing a legend to make its point. A mountain face nobody thought could be climbed, taken in one night. A beachhead line held for 99 days by a force too small to hold it. A city entered ahead of armies many times its size. A casualty rate that should have ended a fighting unit that instead just kept fighting. Numbers, not adjectives, and numbers don't need translating. The force's insignia, the red spearhead with USA and Canada stitched into the same patch, didn't disappear when the unit did. The lineage it started runs, officially and on record, straight into the U.S. Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, who trace their institutional ancestry back to that Montana winter. It runs into Canada's own Special Operations Regiment, which carries the battle honors of that Canadian battalion into the present day. Neither of those modern units is the same body of men, but both of them were built, deliberately, by people who wanted to keep something specific alive. The idea that a soldier alone in the dark, with no orders coming, does not stop being dangerous. Somewhere in the National Archives, in a folder among thousands of others captured from a defeated army, is the page a dead German lieutenant filled out in the last weeks of his own war, underlining a line twice because he needed someone above him to understand what he'd seen. He never learned how small the unit actually was. He never learned their names, their hometowns, the mill towns and reservations and mountain training grounds they came from. He knew only what the dark had taught him, that something was out there that didn't behave the way an enemy was supposed to behave, and that whatever word his own language had for it, devil was the closest one that fit.